Undiscovered, to me, it was an irresistible title for a symposium. I had to come to something called that. Now, many Indigenous people around the world complain bitterly about being discovered, unless, of course, they are artists. And the title reminded me of probably my most memorable moment in teaching, and it was in an honours seminar, and it was on the gaze, which gives you an idea how long ago that honours seminar was. It's something we talked about a lot, sort of 15 years ago or 20 years ago. And I have a slide for the gaze. Oh, hang on. I'll master this quickly. If you're ever in the honours seminar on the gaze, you might know what this slide is about. The reading was Sartre, Jean-Paul Sartre's classic essay about the dread of hearing the floorboard creak behind you when you're peeping through a keyhole. The dread of the discoverer being discovered. What Sartre called the shock of being seen. And what was so memorable about that seminar was that one of my students, who was a woman aged about 50, disagreed with Sartre. The shock for me, she said, was no longer being seen. Sartre got it wrong. We want to be seen, we want to be discovered. The issue for Indigenous Australians, I think, was not being discovered, but being undiscovered, or what we call terra nullius. Not being seen when you are there. Now, I was born and raised in Queensland, and I've lived substantial periods of my adult life in Tasmania and Western Australia. I have, you might say, walked the outskirts of invisibility in Australia. So when I wander through our national art collections in Sydney, Melbourne and Canberra, I have for many years looked out for where the art on show is from. And my impression, and my impression hasn't changed over many years, is that if you see a Tasmanian work, it's from the 19th century. If you see a Queensland artwork or a Western Australian work, it's probably by an Aboriginal artist. So what I did last Saturday was to go to the MCA in Sydney and do a little tally of where the art was from. And it came out. It's completely different to what I just told you. Northern Territory has 42% of the art, Western Australia 22% of the art on show. Now, of course, there's a simple... I didn't count one artist, which was a French artist who was on the third floor. I only counted the bottom two floors were all the Australian artists. But it was interesting, I thought, that the Museum of Contemporary Art in Sydney has... all its artists are Australian, just about. There's hardly any international artists, and we think of contemporary art as a sort of global thing. The two... then that's the artist. This is when you take the Aboriginal artists out, what it looks like. And on the bottom here, I've got where you can compare it to the proportion. So 11% of Australians live in Western Australia, and where is it? 4% of the artists were, and 4% was two artists. Brian Blanchflower and Rebecca Bowman. They were the only two Western Australian, non-Indigenous Western Australian artists on show at the MCA at the moment. And of the other 30 are Western Australian artists, 29 are from Matamuli artists. The others are all Indigenous. However, I thought a better analysis to do would to be look at the recent Australia exhibition at the exhibition at the Royal Academy in London, which was organised with the National Gallery of Australia, because I thought it would be a better test, because I reasoned that it would represent how the nation is being presented both in a considered and official way to our former discoverers, our former colonial masters, shall we say. And I thought, because many people would be watching and counting like I was, and because we must factor in the sort of Canberra political correctness thing, I expected something a little bit different to the sort of usual. And to my surprise, there were surprising equity issues. And this is how it came out by gender. By the way, I only looked at artists working since World War I. I didn't look at anything earlier, because I thought that would give us a better picture of what we're sort of mainly interested in. So this is artists working basically 20th century artists. And I looked at both artworks and artists. The exhibition was interesting, was that if you were considered sort of good enough, you got one work, and then there were a couple of artists who got a lot more than one work. So it sort of shifts a bit, and I'll come back to that in a minute. Now, so the first thing to note really is the race comparison. You remember at the last exhibition of Australian art in England, organised in this official way, there was no Aboriginal art whatsoever. So there's been this huge shift in what has been discovered in Australian art since 1962, when the last exhibition was on, and now. So if our measure of being discovered is getting into the Australia exhibition, then the big equity issues are gender and race. You have an uphill battle if you are female and non-Aboriginal in Australia. Now remember that the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders account for only 3% of the total population. Now I'm not a mathematician, so I might have got this wrong, but I think that means that you're 30 times more likely to be discovered if you are Aboriginal in Australia. And when we look at it at the state background, the breakup in the states, again, the winning state by a long shot is the Northern Territory. It outperforms, I think, if my mathematics is correct, per head of population, nearly 2,500% overrepresented per head of population. The ACT gets it just right proportionally. And Tasmania does a lot better than you think it should. South Australia about 25% better. Queensland underperforms badly. New South Wales underperforms a bit. Victoria underperforms by a good margin. And West Australia does very well comparatively. And these were all sort of interesting to me. I didn't sort of expect a lot of this. But of course there's a not-so-hidden statistic here. Again, it's Aboriginal art. Aboriginal art throws the statistics out completely. So there were actually only 2 Western Australian non-Aboriginal artists in the exhibition, Brian Blanchflower again and Howard Taylor. So Aboriginal artists are so overrepresented these days that they distort the statistics. If we do a comparison of white artists only, then New South Wales and Victoria are the best performers. If I got it here, I think. Yeah, non-Indigenous artists. So anyway, that's the facts or the stats, if you like. Then the question comes, is there a way of changing this? The statisticians tell the remarkable story of Aboriginal art in Australia. How was it able to achieve such an amazing visibility, especially since it has no state apparatus or national gallery to support it? To me, the Aboriginal art situation is an amazing example of how to become discovered. How did it do this? How did it become discovered? Are there any lessons for non-Aboriginal artists in this? Now, one obvious way, I think, for a non-Aboriginal artist to become discovered is to collaborate with an Aboriginal artist. Now, people are actually doing this, by the way. The amount of collaboration with Aboriginal artists has gone up enormously since they've been discovered. No one was really doing it, except for Rex Batterby, I think, before then. And I'm afraid non-Western Australian artists are beating you to it. One example, for example, the collaboration between the Sydney filmmaker Lynette Woolworth and the New York transgender singer Anthony of Anthony and the Johnsons, and Martu artists at Martamuli Art Centre in the Pilbara. They featured at the recent Adelaide Biennale. And currently, at the moment, that's what the work looked like. And currently, at the moment, the Italian artist Giorgio Severi is doing a collaborative art with Balgo artists for next year's Venice Biennale. Now, you might think that this is a cynical move on the part of these non-Indigenous artists. But however, I think both of these artists saw something in Aboriginal art that spoke to their own projects as artists. Otherwise, the collaborations wouldn't have really worked. Severi, for example, is deeply interested in the ancestral connections she trips over every day in Italy, and is a trained archaeologist, and that's why she became interested in similar issues with Indigenous art. And she believes that such connections, such sort of ancestral, what she calls ancestral connections, hold the key to dealing with what she says is the current global problems, which she blames on the great forces of modernity, of capitalism and nationalism. And this, I think, brings us to an important reason why Aboriginal art was discovered sometime in the 1980s. Now, modernity and capitalism might show no signs of ageing, but nationalism is giving way to the forces of globalism. The Sidney Nolan generation was probably the last and arguably the first, I think, to be actually really interested in the question of national identity. And even then, it was an identity that appealed mostly to a British sense of what our national identity should be, which is why Nolan, Boyd and Drysdale, etc., spent so much time there, over there. However, the idea of contemporary art, and this is what contemporary art sort of looked like when Indigenous art was discovered in the mid to late 80s. The idea of contemporary art, however, is orientated to globalism, not nationalism, not ideas of national identity. And here, Aboriginal art was ahead of the pack in the mid-1980s. It was discovered when it began to be marketed as contemporary art rather than primitive art. And that was the great if you like, marketing device that allowed it to be discovered. As primitive art, it served a national agenda, giving white Australian art a sort of a sense of its own historical pedigree, as in Margaret Preston's art. But once liberated from the straitjacket of nationalism, it never looked back. Closely connected with this post-nationalism was the post-colonial theory associated with it, which in the 1990s focused art world attention on the rest, not the West. And this turbo-boosted Indigenous art in Australia, while at the same time unfortunately being an impediment to those artists associated with what we might call Westernism, with Western art, non-Indigenous art. Nowhere is this more evident than in Terry Smith's book on contemporary art. And even his cover, I suppose, tells you the story of what contemporary art is about. It's one of the few books on contemporary art published recently that actually include Australia in its scheme. However, Aboriginal art dominates his account of Australian contemporary art. Secondly, post-colonial theory introduced ideas like, slogans we've heard often in recent times, like world art and globalism to art world discourse. And for those who were here in 2011, you would have heard Terry Smith, when he was promoting this book, when it had just come out, tell us at UWA that the idea of contemporary art was now a fully theorised idea. It was like a theory of being, it was a way of being. It no longer just meant art made today. What makes art contemporary, he told us now, is the contemporaneity of its elements. That is, the sort of simultaneity of the differences that it deals with. Thus, contemporary art was geared, he said, to ideas of cosmopolitanism, of differences, living together, of just being together and being the same. So it was geared to ideas of cosmopolitanism and globalism and what's sometimes called creolisation and diasporic relations. Lots of jargon in this lecture, unfortunately. Discourses that are all of them hostile to what used to be called in the 80s identity discourses, be they national identity or sexual identity or racial identity. That's why I think amongst the most discovered in WA are right here at UWA, which are Symbiotica, who engage with a global issue, biotechnology, and related issues of anthropocentrism. These are sort of the ideas that sort of circulate in contemporary art exhibitions these days, rather than identity discourses. Now, the discourse of the nation-state, it's not that it has sort of gone away, it's still there, but it will always privilege the culture of the centre, where the power of the nation-state is located. You just will never get around that. Yet remote Aboriginal artists who live in the most disempowered, far-flung places in the nation, indeed the world, are among the most discovered. You know, that's one of the great paradoxes of contemporary art. That shows you how the discourse of the nation-state doesn't sort of seem to matter anymore in the art world. Globalism has the potential to free local communities from the agenda of the nation-state, even though the art world is an increasingly bureaucratised place administered by the state. That's another sort of great paradox, I reckon. This to me is most evident in the important role that biennales have played or are playing in contemporary art. The idea of contemporary art is very much the invention of biennales. And biennales are organised by cities, not by nation-states. For example, Documenta, the most prestigious and influential exhibition of contemporary art, is an enterprise of the city of Kassel, which only has a population of 200,000 people. It's not even in Berlin or Paris. Now, at the last Documenta, a few years ago, there were 7 Australian artists, the most Australian artists that have ever got into Documenta. 3 of whom were Aboriginal, and 3 of whom were born in Western Australia. 2 were Aboriginal, of course, out of that 3. Although the non-Indigenous artist born in Perth now lives in Melbourne. And I'll just show you who they were, just so... Oh, sorry, wrong way. This is who they were and where they were born and where they live. Another interesting paradox about being a contemporary artist, you can be dead. You can be dead for quite a long time and still be a contemporary artist and be discovered in Documenta. Margaret Preston wasn't the only one of her generation in Documenta, by the way. In fact, I think there was a Neolithic work of art in there. And this is what their art looked like and how it was displayed. 2 Western Australian artists. The first time remote Aboriginal art had ever got into Documenta. Northern Territory artist, our Perth artist, Perth-born artist, lives in Melbourne. That's his artwork that he did at Documenta, or one of the artworks he did at Documenta. Sydney-based artist, Brisbane-based artist. These are the little Margaret Prestons there on the right. And there are more Margaret Prestons there. Gordon Bennett complained that everyone thought that these paintings he did were Margaret Prestons. And that these were the studies she'd done for them. So is there a pattern here? Now, not only were there an unusually large number of Australians in the last Documenta, but for the first time remote Aboriginal art was exhibited. Despite the and this is interesting too, because despite the phenomenal success of remote Aboriginal art in Australia, it's generally failed to capture the imagination of international curators. Urban Aboriginal artists have been the more successful. They are the ones who are discovered internationally, whereas in Australia it tends to be, remote Aboriginal art. The reason, and there are probably several reasons for this, but the reason I want to talk about right now is that they, the urban Indigenous artists, better fit the paradigm of the diaspora, whereas remote Aboriginal artists, like nationalism, are too associated with international curators with identity discourse, with an old paradigm. Interestingly, 3 of those artists in Documenta came out of one dealer in Brisbane who has a focus on the world in the way he undertakes his work, and it was an interesting statistic I thought as well. And not one of his artists was a remote Indigenous artist either. So now sort of going down a little bit deeper about Aboriginal art, Desart's logo, culture first, and the anxiety to protect it from the outside that one hears from remote communities so often, only adds to the sense that for overseas curators that Indigenous art, remote Indigenous art, is not really about contemporary art, that it's a sort of identity discourse. For example, Nicholas Rothwell reported that the chair of Charla Arts at Armiter, Frank Young, up the top there, saying, a lot of people are trying to get into the world of our stories. You hear this all the time. I'm just giving it as sort of one example. Outside people want to come in. When an exhibition's on, they want to know the real inner story. And here, this way, in these paintings now, we want to draw the line. We want to stop you coming in. Contemporary art is, of course, all about the exact opposite of that. It's about opening the gates. Rothwell also reported, this is Charla Arts' best-known painter, Hector Burton, seen there, as saying that they, the artists, make art to defend their children and grandchildren from the dark temptations of modernity. It sounds like my grandfather used to sound like. This is a far cry from the spirit of globalism and cosmopolitanism. The question for remote Aboriginal artists who want to be discovered really is how to become cosmopolitan. How much longer have I got? 2 minutes. Right. I better skip over that. I was going to talk about a curator, Okwai Enwazor, who's probably been the most successful artist at discovering a whole continent, which is African artists who were undiscovered. And his two main themes in terms of the artist that he chooses is that he won't choose an artist if the work is about national identity, about African national identity, and he won't choose it if the art is about being Indigenous. And the interesting thing about Africa, unlike Australia, even though it was colonised, is that the colonisers in Africa trained the Indigenous Africans to rule the country, unlike in Australia. So that those trained Africans who were trained back in England and France either took back those countries or they were given back to them. So that we've had the remarkable fact that in Africa, in the late 20th century, Africa, which was once considered 99.9% Indigenous, now only officially has 5% of its population that's classed as Indigenous. All the rest are citizens of nation states. And so the discourse of Indigenous, identity discourse of Indigenousness has a very different sort of flavour in Africa. And Okwai Enwazor, the first I was going to talk about the first two Johannesburg Biennales, and Okwai Enwazor in the first Johannesburg Biennale, sorry, he didn't do the first Johannesburg Biennale, but the first Johannesburg Biennale, which I think was 1995 or somewhere like that, it was called Africus, and it was very much about identity discourse. What does it mean to be an African? And when Okwai Enwazor came in, who's a Nigerian but has lived in New York for many years, he had to flee the Biafran War, he completely turned that around, and he called his Biennale Trade Routes, and it was about the African diaspora. Now, he has been very successful at putting African art on the map of contemporary art. There he is. He was in Australia very recently looking for art for the Venice Biennale. He's the art advisor of the next Venice Biennale. This is his documenta in 2002. That's all African art there. And forgot what I was going to say there. His big slogan is, I'll just read out his slogan and then I'll go to my conclusion, is transnational, transurban, transdiasporic, transcultural practices. Ari said, transforming the ways in which we understand the world. And if artists don't recognise that, he said, they won't be discovered, if their art doesn't do that. Now, and I'll end with this. This was in his acclaimed exhibition called The Short Century in 2001 in one of the front essays. The only way forward is to challenge the idea that we must define political identity, political rights and political justice first and foremost in relation to indigeneity. Now, there were only 2 Indigenous artists in Okwai Enwezor's documenta, and he is the curator of post-colonial art, and Indigenous art didn't get in there. So there's a lot of questions to be asked around that. Why? Now, I can't see the Australian art world going down this track in my lifetime. That is, this track that we shouldn't be looking at Indigenous issues, because we have our own demons to slay here in this country. Yet there's an important lesson to be learnt by both Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australian artists from Enwezor's success, because he has been incredibly successful as a curator. That to be discovered, the local must be thought in terms of how the transnational, transurban, transdiasporic, transcultural practices are transforming the ways in which we experience the local, our world. Demanding a fairer representation from the bureaucracies and galleries of the Australian nation-state won't get you far. Even if this representation was forthcoming, the dominant discourse of the nation-state, which is centred in that sort of Bermuda Triangle of Sydney, Canberra and Melbourne, would remain. This is why the University of Melbourne, I'll end on this note, and not the University of Western Australia, is about to create the Hugh Ramsey Chair of Australian Art History. Let's hope Enwezor applies. How could they refuse him? Thank you.